Have you ever noticed how Jesus faced the most challenging moments of his life? Not in a hurry, not with panic, but with a calm that seemed capable of silencing any storm. In the midst of the chaos, while crowds demanded miracles, enemies plotted against him, and until the cross approached, Jesus taught us something transformative. Calm is not passivity, but power. Today, we're going to explore 15 incredible lessons that Jesus left us about the power of calm. Whether it's the way he calmed literal storms or the calmness with which he handled criticism and betrayal, these lessons can change the way we face our own challenges. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will have in your hands not just inspirations, but practical steps to live the powerful calm that Jesus showed us. A calm that renews strength, brings peace, and reflects the very heart of God. The calm in the midst of the storm. Imagine being on a boat in the middle of a rough sea. The waves seem bigger than ever. The winds roar and the water starts to rush in. You scream for help, but it seems like no one is listening. Now think, how would you react if you saw someone in the midst of this chaos sleeping peacefully? This was exactly the scenario the disciples faced when they accompanied Jesus on a boat. The history recorded in Matthew 8:23-27, it is a story that goes far beyond the simple miracle of calming a physical storm. She reveals the power of calm as a spiritual force that not only transforms situations, but also changes hearts and perspectives. Jesus, when sleeping in the midst of the storm, teaches us that true calm does not depend on external circumstances, but on an unshakable trust in God's care. The disciples, many of them experienced fishermen, were familiar with the sea. They knew how to deal with strong winds and high waves, but that night the storm was different. It was fierce enough to make men accustomed to danger feel fear. In their rush to find a solution, they woke Jesus with a desperate tone. "Lord, save us. Let's die." Matthew 8:25. This phrase reveals a lot about how we usually react to the storms of life. When challenges seem to swallow us, we tend to seek quick and immediate answers. We want to act, fix, resolve. But often our rush is rooted in fear and a lack of trust in God. Jesus, on the other hand, responded completely differently. Before calming the wind and sea, Jesus looked at his disciples and asked, "Why are you so afraid, you of little faith?" Matthew 8:26. This question confronts us directly. How many times do we allow fear to control our actions? How many times do we forget that God is in the boat with us? Jesus' calmness in the face of that situation was not only a demonstration of his divine authority, but also an invitation for the disciples and for us to experience a faith that overcomes panic. Jesus stood up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was great calm. But the real miracle was not just that the sea remained calm. It was the transformation that this experience brought to the hearts of the disciples. They asked each other, "Who is this that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Matthew 8:27. The power of Jesus' calm revealed something greater. He is Lord of all things, including the storms we face. This story challenges us to reflect. How do we react when storms arrive? Too often we allow fear, anxiety, and despair to take control. We run from side to side trying to find solutions, but we end up forgetting that he who has power over all things is with us. Jesus sleeping in the boat is a symbol of total trust in God's plan. He knew that nothing, not even the force of nature, was beyond the Father's control. Applying this to our lives, we can realize that calm is a faith-based choice. It's not about ignoring problems or pretending they don't exist, but about remembering that we have a God who is above any storm. When we allow God's peace to rule our hearts, we face challenges differently. But how can we cultivate this calm in times of difficulty? First, we need to learn to recognize God's presence in our lives, even when it seems like He is sleeping. He is never indifferent to our struggles. His presence is constant, and He expects us to trust Him. Second, we need to train our minds and hearts to trust His promises. This happens through prayer and meditation on His Word. Remember, Jesus did not promise that we would never face storms, On the contrary, he said, "In the world you will have tribulation. However, take heart, I have overcome the world." John 16:33. This promise gives us the certainty that regardless of the intensity of the wind or the size of the waves, he has already won for us. The story of the boat and the storm also reminds us of something fundamental. Our reaction to challenges can impact the people around us. Just as Jesus' calmness brought peace to the disciples, our faith and trust in God can serve as a testimony to others. When we face difficulties with serenity, we show the world that we believe in a God who is bigger than any problem. Ultimately, the most powerful lesson from this episode is that calm is not something we achieve through human effort, but a fruit of our connection with God. It is the result of a life lived in His presence, where we learn to rest in His care and trust in His sovereignty. As we reflect on this story, ask yourself, where have you sought calm in times of difficulty? Have you been running around, trying to figure everything out on your own, or have you rested in the fact that God is with you? Today, Jesus invites us to surrender our storms to Him, to trust that He has the power to calm the wind and the waves, and to rest in the certainty that He is the Lord of our lives. Silence in the face of provocation. The calm that Jesus demonstrated in the boat while the storm raged was not just for that moment. He carried this serenity with Him in all situations, even the most difficult ones. And one of the most profound ways in which Jesus' calmness manifested itself was in His response to hatred and provocation. There is no more powerful example of this than the scene of Jesus before Pilate, when He was unfairly interrogated and yet remained silent. The story told in Matthew 27:12-14. It's impressive. There was Jesus, the Son of God, falsely accused by religious leaders, humiliated before a crowd that cried out for His death. Pilate, confused by Jesus' calmness, asked, "Don't you hear how many things they are accusing you of?" And despite the fiery words and unfounded accusations, Jesus did not respond. His silence was not a sign of weakness, but of spiritual strength. In a human context, Jesus' silence was disconcerting. After all, He had every right to defend Himself. He could have exposed the lies of the Pharisees and Sadducees, explained His actions, and revealed His innocence. But Jesus knew that the truth did not need to be defended with words when lived with integrity. His silence carried a message much deeper than any argument: trust in God's plan. This kind of calm seems far from our reality. When we are provoked or wronged, our immediate reaction is to defend ourselves. We want to prove ourselves right, clear up misunderstandings, and often fight back. However, Jesus shows us that there is a better way. His silent response reveals a faith that transcends the pressures of the moment. He did not need to convince Pilate, the religious leaders, or the crowd. His security was established in the Father. Jesus' silence challenges us to rethink how we react to life's challenges. We often face situations in which we are misunderstood, criticized, or unfairly accused. At these times, the instinct is to justify ourselves. But will our words really bring the peace we seek? Jesus teaches us that true calm comes from trusting God to deal with circumstances. It is difficult to imagine what was going through Pilate's mind as he watched Jesus. He probably expected screams, justifications, or even pleas for mercy, as was common among the accused. But Jesus' silence surprised him. The Roman governor realized that he was facing someone different, someone whose inner peace could not be shaken by external pressures. This same peace is available to us if we learn to rest in the Lord. Silence can also be a powerful weapon against hate. When Jesus chose not to respond, He disarmed His accusers. There was no fuel to fuel the flames of verbal violence. He interrupted the cycle of provocations with a stillness that transcends human understanding. This stillness, born of absolute trust in God, has the power to transform not only the situations around us, but also our own hearts. We often confuse calm with passivity, but Jesus shows us that being calm does not mean being indifferent. On the contrary, true calm requires courage, and self-control. Reacting calmly in difficult situations is a sign of strength, not weakness. This calm allows us to act in accordance with God's principles rather than reacting impulsively to circumstances. Throughout his life, Jesus showed us that silence can be more eloquent than 1,000 words. He chose not to defend himself because he knew that God's purpose was being fulfilled even in that moment of injustice. This is a difficult but essential lesson. Not every battle needs to be fought with words. Sometimes the greatest demonstration of faith is to remain silent and let God act. When we look at Jesus' reaction before Pilate, we are reminded that calm is not something we achieve alone. It is the fruit of an intimate connection with God. The more we trust in the Lord, the less we are shaken by life's provocations and challenges. This confidence allows us to stand firm even when the world around us is falling apart. And so, the calm we saw on the boat continues to reveal itself. It is not just a quality for moments of peace, but a strength that sustains in times of trial. And like the storm at sea, Jesus' silence in the face of provocations was not an end point, but the beginning of something greater. Pausing to pray, Jesus' silence before Pilate showed us an unshakable calm, but there is something even deeper that sustained this serenity: his constant connection with the Father through prayer. If we want to understand the secret of the calm that Jesus demonstrated in every moment of his life, we need to look at his intentional pauses to pray. In Lucas 5:16, we find a simple but meaningful statement: Jesus withdrew to solitary places and prayed. This habit of seeking solitude was an essential part of Jesus' life. No matter how busy he was, he always found time to be alone with God. The calm that he exuded in the most challenging situations was not the result of inner strength, but of a deep and continuous relationship with the Father. Jesus' life was full of demands. Crowds followed him, expecting healings, miracles, and words of wisdom. His disciples depended on him for guidance and teaching. The religious leaders were constantly trying to catch him in contradictions, and yet he never seemed overwhelmed or anxious. Whenever the weight of responsibilities increased, Jesus did something surprising. He walked away. This pause to pray was not an act of escape, but of renewal. It was in the silence of God's presence that Jesus found the strength to continue. He knew that, without this time of communion, it would be impossible to fulfill the mission for which he had been sent. Prayer was not just a time to ask, but a space to listen, rest, and trust. When we look at the frenetic pace of the modern world, it's easy to see why so many of us struggle to find calm. We are always running, always connected, always worried. But Jesus' practice reminds us that true calm comes from stopping. Stop to be with God. Stop to hear his voice. Stopping to give him our burdens. Pausing to pray was not just a routine in Jesus' life, it was the very essence of his walk. However, it is important to note how these pauses connected directly to the most crucial moments of his ministry. Before calling the 12 apostles, Jesus spent the night in prayer. Before facing the cross, he sought the Father in Gethsemane. These moments show us that prayer is the source of strength and direction in the midst of our greatest challenges. But Jesus' prayer was not made up of empty formulas or repetitions. It was an intimate and honest conversation with the Father. When Jesus went away to pray, he took his joys, worries, and challenges with him. He knew that prayer was not just a religious duty, but a transformative encounter. This understanding challenges us to rethink how we relate to prayer. How often do we treat prayer as a last resort rather than a first response? We run to God only when the storm has already hit us. But Jesus shows us that true calm begins in anticipation, in seeking the Father before challenges even arrive. This practice of praying constantly is what enables us to face difficulties with serenity. Furthermore, Jesus' habit of retreating to solitary places teaches us about the importance of cultivating stillness. We live in a world that values productivity, where silence and solitude are often seen as a waste of time. Yet it is precisely in this space of stillness that we find the peace that the world cannot offer. Prayer in solitude disconnects us from external pressures and reconnects us to the heart of God. Pausing to pray also reminds us that we are not alone. In moments of pressure, it is common to feel that everything depends on us, that we are the only ones responsible for finding solutions. But prayer frees us from this weight. When we turn to God, we recognize that He is in control and that we can trust His wisdom and provision. While Jesus was in the boat with the disciples, His calmness was a reflection of His trust in God, and this trust was fueled by His moments of prayer. When we feel overwhelmed, we can learn from Him to seek a place of spiritual renewal. This place doesn't have to be physical, it is a state of heart and mind. Jesus' practice challenges us to create moments of pause in our busy lives. It could be early in the morning, before the worries of the day catch up with us, or at night, when we reflect on everything that has happened. The important thing is to make prayer a constant habit, a refuge where we find calm and strength to continue. Pausing to pray is not isolation from the world, but a preparation to face it with confidence. When Jesus left His moments of prayer, He returned renewed, ready to deal with crowds, challenges, and even those who rejected Him. His calmness before others was a direct result of the peace He found in the presence of God. When observing Jesus' practice, we are invited to reflect: how have we dealt with the weight of our responsibilities? Are we trying to carry it all alone, or are we seeking the rest and direction that only God can provide? Prayer is not just a tool, it's a reminder that we don't have to walk alone. Jesus shows us that pausing to pray is the secret to a balanced life, a life in which we can weather storms calmly, respond to hate with silence, and move forward with confidence, knowing that God is with us, the peace that disarms fear. As the disciples watched Jesus in prayer, it was impossible not to notice how something seemed to flow from Him, a peace that spread beyond words, calming the hearts of those nearby. This peace was not simply the absence of conflicts, but a living and transforming presence which brought security even in the most uncertain moments. Jesus on His journey offered this peace clearly and constantly, and one of His most impactful promises was recorded in John 14:27, when He said, "Peace I leave with you, I give you my peace. I don't give it as the world gives it. Do not let your hearts be troubled, nor be afraid." This verse takes us to a profound aspect of Jesus' character. His peace was not superficial or circumstantial. While the peace of the world depends on external conditions, the peace of Jesus transcended all of that. It was a peace capable of facing fear, transforming anxious hearts, and bringing stability even in the midst of chaos. He did not promise His disciples a life free from hardship, but He assured them that no matter what they faced, His peace would be with them. It is fascinating to see how the peace that Jesus offered was intrinsically linked to trust in the Father. Jesus' life was a constant demonstration of this trust. He walked knowing that the Father was in control of everything, and this certainty was reflected in His words and actions. When He invited His disciples not to let their hearts be troubled, He was not offering a magic formula to avoid worry. Instead, He called them to connect with the source of true peace, their relationship with God. If fear is a powerful force that can paralyze us, cloud our vision, and lead us to impulsive decisions. Jesus knew this, and so He often directed His followers to trust, rest, and remember that God was in charge. The invitation not to fear was not just a request, but a reaffirmation that God's presence is enough to disarm any fear. When we look at the words of Jesus, we may ask ourselves, how does this peace manifest itself in our lives? The answer lies in the very way He lived. Jesus did not avoid challenges or difficult situations. On the contrary, he faced them head-on, but always with the serenity of someone who knew that nothing could separate him from the Father's love. This same security is offered to us. Fear often arises from our perception that we are alone or helpless, but Jesus, in promising his peace, reminds us that we are never alone. His presence is constant, even when circumstances tell us otherwise. And it is exactly this presence that enables us to face our fears, not because we have all the answers, or because the difficulties will disappear, but because we know that the one who calms the storms is also on our side. This promise of peace is more than a comfort. It is a call to action. When we allow the peace of Jesus to rule our hearts, we begin to live differently. Instead of reacting with anxiety or despair, we can respond with calm and confidence. This not only transforms our internal experience, but also impacts those around us. The peace of Jesus is contagious. She inspires hope and brings light where there is darkness. As the disciples heard these words, they may not have fully understood what Jesus was offering. After all, they were still about to face the trauma of the crucifixion and the apparent absence of their master. However, it was precisely at this moment that the promise of peace became more real. When all external circumstances seemed to contradict the presence of God, the peace that Jesus had promised stood as a testimony to his faithfulness. That peace remains available to us today. No matter how great the challenges or how deep the fear we face, we can turn to the one who said, "Do not be afraid." His words are not just a comfort, but a transformative truth which has the power to free us from the grip of fear and lead us to a life of confidence and fulfillment. Calm in caring for others. Jesus' words about peace were not just speeches, they translated into actions. He demonstrated this peace in every detail of his life, especially in how he cared for those around him. No matter how exhausting the day or how large the crowd, Jesus always found time to meet the needs of others. One of the most striking examples of this is in John 6:1-14, when he fed a crowd of 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. This story reveals not only the power of Jesus, but also his calmness in dealing with seemingly impossible situations. Imagine the scenario: a hungry crowd, far from any source of food, and the disciples looking to Jesus for a solution. The natural response would be despair, worry, or even impatience. But Jesus, instead, responded with serenity and purpose. Jesus' calm was evident from the beginning. He did not see the crowd as a problem, but as an opportunity to demonstrate God's care. Before any miracle, Jesus asked the disciples to check the available resources. This may seem like a detail, but it is significant. Instead of rushing to resolve the situation spectacularly, he began by assessing what they already had on hand. This attitude teaches us the importance of looking at what we have, even when it seems little, before allowing ourselves to be consumed by worry. When the disciples presented the 5 loaves and 2 fish, they probably did so with a mixture of faith and doubt. How could that be enough? However, Jesus did not focus on limited resources. He received them with gratitude, raised his eyes to heaven, and blessed them. This simple yet meaningful gesture demonstrates the unbroken connection between his calmness and his trust in the Father. Jesus knew that in God's hands, even the smallest resource can become an abundant blessing. As Jesus distributed the food, he was also teaching the disciples something profound. Caring for others begins with a heart at peace. Anxiety and fear often lead us to act hastily, while calmness allows us to see possibilities that might otherwise go unnoticed. Jesus was not just meeting a physical need, he was showing how caring for others is a reflection of God's character. The crowd, which initially seemed like a problem, became a testimony to divine generosity. Everyone ate and was satisfied, and there were still 12 baskets full of pieces left. This final detail is a reminder that God not only meets our needs, but he does so abundantly. When we act calmly and with faith, we allow God to work miracles in our lives and in the lives of those around us. This story challenges us to reflect on how we deal with the needs of others. In a world marked by rush and excess demands, it is easy to lose sight of the importance of caring for others. We are often tempted to think that we don't have enough time, energy, or resources to help. But Jesus' attitude shows us that caring for others does not require great deeds. It starts with the willingness to offer what we have, no matter how small it may seem. Jesus' calmness is also an example of how to deal with stress and pressure. The disciples were worried, and the crowd probably showed signs of impatience. Even so, Jesus did not let himself be carried away by these emotions around him. He remained centered and focused on his mission. This ability to act calmly, even in high-tension situations, is something we can all strive for. Furthermore, Jesus' care for the crowd reminds us that calm is not passivity. He didn't ignore people's needs or delay the solution. On the contrary, he acted with intention and purpose. The calm that Jesus demonstrated was the fruit of his trust in the Father, and this trust allowed him to act with clarity and wisdom. When we face challenging situations, we can learn from Jesus' example. Instead of letting ourselves be dominated by haste or frustration, we can stop, evaluate the resources we have, and trust that God can do a lot with little. This approach not only eases our own hearts, but also allows us to care for others with more patience and compassion. The crowd fed by Jesus witnessed something more than a physical miracle. They have experienced the power of divine care, a care that not only meets immediate needs, but also points to God's goodness and faithfulness. That same kindness is available to us today. When we face our own hungry crowds, whether they are everyday pressures, family responsibilities, or unexpected challenges, we can remember that the same Jesus who fed the 5,000 is at our side, ready to guide and provide. So as we reflect on this story, we are invited to look at our lives with fresh eyes. Where we have seen problems, perhaps there are opportunities to demonstrate God's care. Where we have felt that our resources are insufficient, perhaps there is the starting point for a miracle. And where we have faced pressure, we can find, in the calm of Jesus, an example to be followed and a peace that sustains us. The power of waiting for the right time. As Jesus fed the crowd and taught his disciples, he demonstrated something that went beyond his immediate words and actions. In every miracle, in every gesture of care, there was a deep respect for God's perfect timing. This lesson becomes even more evident in moments like the story of John 11, 1-6, when Jesus was informed of Lazarus' illness. His seemingly unusual reaction reveals a calm that defies our understanding and invites us to trust in God's timing, even when everything within us cries out for urgency. Lazarus, a close friend of Jesus, was seriously ill, and his sisters, Mary and Martha, sent a message asking for Jesus' help. The message carried the urgency anyone would feel in a life or death situation. The one you love is sick. Anyone would expect Jesus to drop everything and go immediately to Bethany. But instead, he remained where he was for 2 more days. To human eyes, this seemed like an inexplicable delay, even negligence. However, Jesus was fully aware of what he was doing. This decision of Jesus was not a lack of compassion, but an expression of his trust in God's greater plan. He knew that the delay would not only bring a greater result to the glory of God, but it would also teach Mary, Martha, and everyone present a lesson about faith and about waiting in the Father's perfect timing. This calmness of Jesus in the face of the urgency of such a delicate situation teaches us the importance of resting in God. Even when circumstances pressure us to act quickly, God's timing often does not align with ours. When we face crises, our natural tendency is to seek immediate answers and solutions. We want to see results now, solve problems as soon as possible, and alleviate our anxieties. But Jesus shows us that when we trust in the Father, we can wait with serenity, knowing that He is working for our good, even when we cannot see it. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. Martha, full of pain, went to Jesus and said, "If you had been here, my brother would would not have died. Martha's statement reflects the feeling many of us feel when we face divine delays. In our minds, we tend to think that if God had acted sooner, everything would be different. But Jesus' response is proof that God's timing is never wrong. He replied, "Your brother will rise again." The dialogue between Jesus and Martha is deeply revealing. He led her from limited faith to deeper trust, showing that even when all seems lost, God is still in control. This wait, which at first seemed unnecessary, became the stage for one of the greatest manifestations of God's power. When Jesus commanded Lazarus to come out of the tomb, the glory of God was revealed in a way that no rush could have provided. This story challenges us to reflect on our own reactions to God's timing. Often when we face delays or seemingly unanswered prayers, we become frustrated or doubt God's care. But Jesus' calmness in moments like these reminds us that the Father always works on our behalf, even when we don't understand his ways. God's delay is never a lack of interest, but rather an opportunity for us to learn to trust him more deeply. Jesus' calmness, once again, was not passivity. He did not ignore Mary and Martha's pain, nor did he fail to act. On the contrary, he used that moment to demonstrate that God's timing is not only perfect, but also filled with love and purpose. Just as he brought life to Lazarus at the right time, he continues to work in our lives in ways that we often only understand later. This trust in God's timing also frees us from the weight of anxiety. When we try to force things to happen in our time, we often become frustrated and burn out. But when we learn to wait calmly, we can rest, knowing that God is in control and that his promises never fail. This active, faith-based waiting is not inertia, but a testimony of our trust in God. Jesus knew that the wait in Bethany was not just about Lazarus. It was about revealing something greater, something that pointed to his own resurrection and the eternal power of God. Every step, every decision was in harmony with the Father's plan. This harmony reminds us that we are not alone in our waits. Just as Jesus walked in confidence, we can also trust that God is with us in every moment of uncertainty, guiding us towards the purpose he has prepared. Pausing, calming down, and waiting for God's right time are invitations to deepen our relationship with him. When we rest in the certainty that the Lord is never late, we experience a peace that transforms our perspectives and enables us to face challenges with a renewed faith, serenity in teaching. Jesus' calmness in the face of God's timing not only manifested itself in extraordinary situations, but permeated every aspect of his life, especially in his teaching. He had impressive patience with his disciples, even when they did not fully understand his words or actions. On several occasions, Jesus had to repeat important lessons, using parables, symbolic gestures, and even direct questions, all with the same serenity and dedication. A clear example of this is in Marcos 9:31-34, when Jesus tried to prepare his disciples for the moment of his death and resurrection. As they walked, Jesus said, "The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and 3 days after he dies, he will rise again." It was a profound revelation, loaded with spiritual and emotional implications. However, the disciples did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask. Instead of paying attention to what Jesus was teaching, they began to argue among themselves about who would be greatest in the kingdom of God. This episode reveals not only the disciples' difficulty in understanding the truths that Jesus shared, but also the patience with which he dealt with these situations. Jesus did not react with frustration or impatience. He did not raise his voice or rebuke them harshly. Instead, he sat down with them and explained once again what really mattered. He called a child to him and said, "Whoever wants to be first must be last, and servant of all." This approach of Jesus is a powerful example of how teaching should be done calmly and lovingly. He knew that the disciples' understanding was limited, but he was not angry about it. On the contrary, he used every opportunity, even apparent failures, to deepen the lessons. Jesus' calmness in his teaching was not only a reflection of his patience, but also of his confidence in the process. He knew that the transformation of the disciples' hearts would take time, but he was willing to walk with them through each stage of this learning. How many times in our own lives do we find ourselves like the disciples, confused or distracted by God's truths? Too often, we allow our pride, our worries, or our lack of understanding to keep us from what Jesus is trying to teach us. And yet, he continues to teach us with the same patience and serenity. Just as he did with the disciples, he calls us back, repeating the necessary lessons until our hearts and minds open to the truth. Jesus' example challenges us to reflect on how we respond when teaching or guiding others. In a world where impatience is common and expectations of quick results are constant, it's easy to lose our cool when others don't meet our expectations. However, the serenity of Jesus shows us a different path. Teaching calmly is not just a matter of temperament, but an act of love and faith. It is believing that even when the results are not immediate, God is working in people's hearts. Furthermore, the way Jesus taught revealed the importance of creating a safe space for learning. The disciples were afraid to ask because they were still stuck in a judgmental and hierarchical mentality. But Jesus, by bringing a child into the center of the conversation, reminded them that the kingdom of God is built on humility, not status. This lesson was not only for the disciples, but also for all of us who seek to better understand the heart of God. Jesus' serenity in teaching was also evident in the way he used everyday circumstances to convey eternal truths. He transformed simple questions, mistakes, and even debates into learning moments. This approach reminds us that teaching does not need to be limited to a specific place or time. Every interaction is an opportunity to share something meaningful, and the calm in our words and actions can open doors for others to listen and learn. This patience in teaching also teaches us about the need to trust God's timing, both in our own learning journey and in those we guide. Just as Jesus knew that his disciples would take time to understand his words, we are also called to be patient with ourselves and others. Spiritual growth is not instantaneous. It is a continuous process of learning, unlearning, and transformation. Jesus showed that teaching is not just about imparting knowledge, but also about forming relationships based on trust, love, and grace. His calmness and patience with the disciples were a reflection of his commitment to them, even when they failed or fell short of his expectations. This same grace is offered to us, encouraging us to keep learning, even when we make mistakes. Jesus' serenity in teaching continues to be an example for all who wish to reflect his character in their lives. He invites us to follow his footsteps, teaching and learning with the same calm and patience, trusting that God is in control of every detail. The loving response to hate. While Jesus taught calmly and patiently, he also lived in a way that embodied his own words. His actions reflected a serenity that disarmed hatred, transforming confrontational situations into opportunities to manifest God's love. One of the most profound moments in which this loving response to hatred is evidenced occurs during the crucifixion, when Jesus, in the midst of unimaginable pain, uttered one of the most impactful phrases in all of Scripture: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Lucas 23:34. Crucifixion was an act of extreme hatred. Jesus, completely innocent, was condemned by a corrupt system, handed over by religious leaders driven by envy, and crucified by soldiers who simply followed orders without realizing the gravity of what they were doing. It was a scenario in which anyone could give in to resentment or anger, but Jesus, even in physical and emotional agony, chose to respond with love. His words of forgiveness were not just for those who literally drove the nails into his hands, but echoed for all of humanity, who in some way contributed to the weight of that cross. This response from Jesus profoundly confronts us. Hatred is a powerful force that tries to dominate us in moments of pain and injustice. When we are hurt, betrayed, or mistreated, the human instinct is to fight back, seek revenge, or at least hold resentment. However, Jesus shows us that true strength lies in loving even those who hurt us. This choice is not natural. It requires a deep trust in God and an understanding that hate only perpetuates more pain, while love has the power to transform. Jesus' words from the cross are even more impressive when we consider the context. He had already been humiliated, beaten, and ridiculed. His hands and feet were embedded in the wood, and every breath was a battle. Even so, he did not think of himself, but of others. He recognized that those who crucified him were blind to the gravity of their actions, and his prayer was a plea for God to grant them grace. This posture of intercession in the midst of extreme suffering reveals to us the heart of Jesus. A heart full of compassion and unconditional love. This loving response to hate teaches us about the power of forgiveness. When Jesus asked the Father to forgive those who crucified him, he opened the way for grace to triumph over judgment. Forgiveness in this case did not mean ignoring the evil that was being done, but handing justice over to God. This is a crucial lesson for anyone who faces the temptation to hold a grudge or retaliate. Jesus shows us that by releasing forgiveness, we are freed from the weight of hate and empowered to live in peace. The ability to forgive is a direct reflection of our trust in God. When we believe that He is righteous and that His wisdom is perfect, we can give our hurts and offenses to Him, knowing that He will take care of every detail. Jesus, in forgiving on the cross, demonstrated a calm that came from His full trust in the Father. He knew that His sacrifice would not be in vain and that God's love would prevail even in the midst of the most intense hatred. This calm in the midst of hate also has a powerful impact on those around us. In the narrative of the crucifixion, one of the soldiers who were present, observing how Jesus faced his death, declared, "Surely this was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54. Jesus' serenity and love were so impactful that they broke down barriers of prejudice and unbelief. That's the power of a loving response. It not only frees us, but it can also open the eyes of those watching us. This example of Jesus challenges us to evaluate our own reactions to hatred and injustice. When we are confronted by harsh words, hostile attitudes, or situations of betrayal, what is our response? Do we follow the world's example, fighting back and perpetuating the cycle of pain? Or do we choose Jesus' path, responding with calm and love? Choosing to love does not mean that we ignore the seriousness of the offense, but that we choose a higher path, trusting God to deal with what is beyond our control. The love that Jesus demonstrated on the cross was not a sentimental or conditional love. It was a sacrificial love, which looked beyond the immediate pain and focused on everyone's redemption. This is the essence of the gospel, a love that conquers hate, a grace that covers sin, and a peace that passes all understanding. When we allow ourselves to live in this love, we find the strength to face even the most difficult circumstances with the same serenity that Jesus demonstrated. Jesus' response to hatred on the cross continues to resonate as a call for us to live differently. He invites us to release forgiveness, love our enemies, and trust in the transformative power of God's grace. Calm when facing death. Jesus' serenity was so profound that he was not shaken even in the face of death. He faced the most difficult time of his life with a calm that transcends human understanding, a calm that can only come from an unshakable trust in the Father. This serenity is powerfully captured in the Garden of Gethsemane, a moment recorded in Matthew 26:36-46, when Jesus prayed shortly before being arrested. That night, Jesus took 3 of his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, with him, and asked them to stay with him while he prayed. He knew what was coming. He knew his hour had come, and anguish began to weigh on him. Jesus' words at that moment reveal the depth of his humanity. "My soul is deeply sad, in mortal sadness. Stay here and watch with me." Even though he was the Son of God, Jesus did not hide his emotions. He showed that true calm is not the absence of feelings, but the ability to face them with faith. Jesus then went away to pray. He knelt before the Father and cried out, "My Father, if it is possible, remove this cup from me. However, not as I want, but as you want." These words are a reflection of the internal battle he faced. On the one hand, there was the weight of the cross and the suffering that lay before him. On the other, there was his total submission to the will of God. This prayer shows us that Jesus' calm was not automatic, but the result of his constant connection with the Father. While Jesus prayed, the disciples who had been invited to watch with him slept. 3 times Jesus returned to find them sleeping, and each time his words seemed filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Can you not watch with me for even an hour?" he asked. These moments reveal the loneliness Jesus faced in his darkest hour. Even surrounded by his closest friends, he was essentially alone. But despite this, he did not allow the loneliness or weakness of others to steal his calm. He continued to pray, continued to seek strength from the Father. The prayer in Gethsemane was a turning point. Jesus entered that garden in anguish, but he left determined. He did not ignore the weight of what was to come, but faced death with a serenity that can only come from those who are completely surrendered to the will of God. When the soldiers arrived to arrest him, he neither fled nor resisted. He stood up and said, "Get up, let's go. Here comes the one who betrays me." These words carry the strength of someone who found peace in the midst of the storm. Jesus' calmness in facing death was not just for his own benefit. She had a direct impact on the people around her. When Peter impulsively drew a sword and cut off the ear of one of the soldiers, Jesus rebuked him and healed the injured man. This gesture was not just an act of compassion, but a clear demonstration that he was in control of the situation. His calm diffused the chaos, reminding everyone that he was there by choice, not obligation. This example of Jesus teaches us that true calm in the face of death or any great challenge does not come from denying reality, but from fully trusting in God. Jesus did not ignore the pain that awaited him, but faced each moment with the certainty that the Father was in control. This trust is what allows us to find serenity, even in the most difficult situations. Often, when faced with our own difficulties, we are tempted to react with fear, despair, or resistance. We want to avoid suffering at all costs, looking for shortcuts, or trying to maintain control. But Jesus shows us that there is another way, the way of surrender. His prayer in Gethsemane was not a plea to escape, but a surrender to God's purpose. He teaches us that true strength is in saying, "Thy will be done." This calm also challenges us to reflect on how we deal with loneliness in times of distress. Just as the disciples slept while Jesus prayed, so often, the people around us fail to support us as we would like. However, Jesus was not shaken by the absence of human support. He found strength in his fellowship with the Father. This lesson reminds us that even when we feel alone, we are never truly abandoned. God is always present, ready to strengthen us. Gethsemane was the place where Jesus won his internal battle, where he decided to face the cross with serenity and courage. This calm was not the absence of pain, but a reflection of his unshakable faith in God's plan. He shows us that even in the darkest of times, it is possible to find peace by surrendering completely to the Father's will. The example of calm to others. Jesus never lived his calm in an isolated or selfish way. The serenity that emanated from him not only impacted his actions, but also transformed the people around him. He lived as a living example of trust in God, inspiring others to find strength and peace in the midst of difficulties. An emblematic moment of this influence can be seen in John 20:19-21, when the resurrected Jesus appeared to the disciples who were locked in a room out of fear of the Jews. It was the day of the resurrection, but the disciples had not yet fully understood the meaning of what had happened. They were filled with fear, confused by the events of the last few days, and unsure of what would come next. Those who had walked alongside Jesus, witnessing his miracles and hearing his promises, were now caught in a storm of doubt and uncertainty. In this context, Jesus appeared among them and said, "Peace be with you." These words were much more than a greeting. They carried the weight of victory over fear and death. Jesus, who had passed through the cross and the tomb, now stood before them, alive and bringing a peace that transcends all understanding. His presence not only comforted the disciples, but also transformed the atmosphere of that place. Where there was once fear, there was now hope. Where there was once doubt, there was now certainty. The impact of Jesus' calm on the disciples is evident in the change that occurred in them. Those men who had been hiding out of fear soon became courageous proclaimers of the gospel, facing persecution and even death with unshakable confidence. The transformation they experienced began there, at that moment when Jesus entered and declared peace. His calm was not just for himself, but to be shared and multiplied. This scene challenges us to reflect on the effect our own calm can have on others. When we face difficulties with serenity and faith, our attitude can inspire those around us to also trust in God. Calm is not just an inner state, but a testimony that can bring light and hope to dark situations. Just as Jesus brought peace to the disciples, we are called to be bearers of that same peace in our relationships and circumstances. Jesus' calmness also teaches us about the importance of presence. He did not send a message or an angel to reassure the disciples. He went to them personally. His presence transformed the environment, and his words reaffirmed God's promises. This shows us that sometimes the simple fact of being present in someone's life with an attitude of serenity and empathy can make all the difference. By saying, "Peace be with you," Jesus was also showing that peace is not the absence of problems, but the certainty that he is with us in the midst of them. The disciples would still face challenges and persecution, but now they had confidence that they were not alone. This trust is what sustains true calm. It's not about ignoring difficulties, but about recognizing that God is in control, even when everything seems uncertain. Furthermore, the way Jesus brought peace to the disciples reminds us of the importance of living this calm intentionally. He didn't just show up, he showed his wounded hands and side as a reminder that the price for peace had already been paid. This visual demonstration reinforced the message that victory was already assured. His calm was anchored in the finished work of the cross and the certainty of the resurrection, and he wanted the disciples to share that same confidence. This trust, in turn, was not just to be experienced individually, but to be carried forward. After declaring peace, Jesus said, "As the Father sent me, so I send you." He was equipping the disciples not just with a message, but with the very peace he had brought. The calm that Jesus experienced and shared was the foundation for the mission they were about to accomplish. This connection between calm and mission challenges us to reflect on the greater purpose of our own serenity. When we experience God's peace in our lives, we are not called to keep it to ourselves, but to share it with the world. Just as Jesus brought calm to the disciples and sent them to be light in the midst of darkness, we are also called to live and transmit this peace in all areas of our lives. Jesus' example shows us that calm is not just a virtue to be cultivated, but a transformative force that can impact our lives and the lives of those around us. His presence among the disciples, bringing peace and renewing their hope, continues to remind us that even in the most difficult times, there is a power in the serenity that comes from trusting in God. Serenity in the multiplication of gifts. Jesus' calmness was not just a characteristic of his personality, it was a constant manifestation of his trust in God and his compassion for those around him. This serenity became even more evident when he faced situations that, to human eyes, seemed impossible. One of the most notable moments in which this calm shone was during the multiplication of the loaves and fishes described in Matthew 14:13-21. Jesus had just received news of the death of John the Baptist, his forerunner and friend. In a moment of pain and mourning, he sought an isolated place to be in prayer and silence. However, the crowds, moved by his presence and his teachings, followed him to that remote location. Despite his personal pain, Jesus looked at these people with compassion. He saw not just a crowd, but individuals with physical and spiritual needs. Calmly, he began to heal the sick and teach about the kingdom of God. The situation took on a new proportion when the disciples, realizing that the day was already ending, suggested that Jesus dismiss the crowd so that they could go to the villages to buy food. Jesus' response was surprising. They don't need to leave. You give them something to eat. For the disciples, this was an impossible task. With just 5 loaves and 2 fish, how could they feed thousands of people? Jesus' reaction to this limitation was a powerful lesson in serenity. He did not panic, lament the lack of resources, or rebuke the disciples for their lack of vision. Instead, he asked them to bring what they had, and looking up to the sky, he gave thanks. This gesture of gratitude, even before the miracle happens, reveals an unshakable trust in God's provision. Jesus knew that little in the hands of the Father could become more than enough. This calm of Jesus is an invitation to rethink how we deal with situations of scarcity or impossibility in our own lives. We are often quick to focus on what is missing, what we cannot do, or the limits that surround us. However, Jesus shows us that true transformation begins when we surrender what we have to God with gratitude and trust. This attitude of faith not only paves the way for miracles, but also teaches us to live with serenity, even in the midst of challenges. When Jesus began distributing the loaves and fish, he not only fed the crowd, but also gave the disciples a practical lesson about trusting God. Every piece of bread they delivered seemed to multiply in their own hands, and what once seemed insufficient became abundant. This transformative moment was possible because Jesus remained calm and acted based on the certainty that God provides. Jesus' serenity also had a direct impact on those around him. The crowd, which was initially hungry and restless, was enveloped in an atmosphere of peace as they received their food. The disciples, who had started the day with doubts, witnessed God's faithfulness in a way that would mark their lives forever. This collective transformation was the result of the calmness that Jesus demonstrated in dealing with the situation. Another important aspect of this story is the fact that at the end, there were still 12 baskets left full of pieces of bread and fish. This abundance was not a fluke, but a reminder that when we surrender our limitations to God, He not only meets our needs, but also pours out blessings beyond our imagination. Jesus, with his serenity and confidence, showed that the kingdom of God does not operate based on human logic, but on divine generosity. This scene challenges us to reflect on how we view our own responsibilities and limitations. When we are faced with tasks that seem beyond our capabilities, we are tempted to react with anxiety or giving up. But Jesus teaches us that instead of focusing on what we don't have, we should trust God and act calmly. This serenity is not passivity, but a disposition of heart that recognizes that God is in control. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes also reveals the role that each of us can play in God's work. The disciples actively participated in the miracle, distributing the food and witnessing divine provision in action. It reminds us that God not only multiplies what we have, but also invites us to be instruments of His grace and provision for others. When we follow Jesus' example and act with calm and faith, we become part of something bigger, something that reflects the Father's love and generosity. Jesus' serenity in multiplying the loaves and fishes continues to inspire those who face challenges and limitations. He shows us that regardless of the magnitude of the need, there is power in trusting God, acting with gratitude, and remaining calm. Calm in controlling emotions. The calmness that Jesus demonstrated was not only an expression of his trust in the Father, but also a deep mastery of his emotions in extreme situations. He not only faced challenges with serenity, but also reacted with balance and firmness in the face of moments of provocation, conflict and injustice. A striking example of this calm, even in the midst of a display of zeal and indignation, is recorded in John 2:13-17, when Jesus expelled the money changers from the temple. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. At the temple, he found people selling oxen, sheep and doves, as well as money changers sitting at their tables, transforming a place of prayer into a noisy and profane market. The scene was one of complete disconnection with the purpose of the temple, which should be a sacred place of encounter with God and worship. Jesus, upon seeing this, took an action that at first glance seems abrupt. He made a whip of ropes and expelled all the sellers and their animals, overturned the money changers' tables and said, "Take these things out of here. Do not make my Father's house a market." The intensity of this scene may give the impression that Jesus was out of control, but when we look closer, we see the opposite. His action was not an impulse or an outburst of unmeasured anger, but a calculated, reflected reaction, and absolutely aligned with his mission and purpose. He not only saw what was wrong, but acted deliberately to correct that which was contrary to the holiness of God. The text gives us important clues about Jesus' emotional state. He did not arrive at the temple and immediately began to act. First, he observed. Jesus saw, understood, and then took the necessary steps. This order shows us that his reaction was marked by calm, even in the midst of a moment of righteous indignation. He was not being impulsive, but reacting with authority and zeal for what was right. This demonstration of calm control over emotions is an invitation to reflect on how we react in situations that bother or provoke us. Often, when we face injustice or inappropriate behavior, our reactions are impulsive and devoid of reflection. We respond emotionally driven by anger without considering the impact or consequences of our words and actions. However, Jesus' example teaches us that it is possible to act firmly and, at the same time, maintain balance and serenity. By driving out the money changers and sellers, Jesus was also sending a powerful message about the holiness of God and the need for respect for that which is sacred. His action was not motivated by personal interest or a need to demonstrate power, but by a deep love for the Father and the purpose of the temple. This zeal for God not only justified his action, but also showed how calmness and self-control go hand in hand with a God-centered life. This attitude of Jesus also teaches us about the importance of discerning when and how to act. Not all situations require an immediate response or direct action. Jesus, on many occasions, chose silence or a different approach. However, at that moment in the temple, he knew that direct action was necessary. This discernment came from his constant connection with the Father and his clear understanding of his mission. Jesus' calm control of his emotions is also evident in the impact of his words and actions. Those in the temple did not confront him or question his authority. On the contrary, his disciples remembered the scriptures that said, "Zeal for your house will consume me." This remembrance was not only an acknowledgement of the fulfillment of Scripture, but also a testimony that Jesus' calm and mastery were deeply aligned with God's will. This episode in the temple challenges us to consider how we deal with our own emotions in times of provocation or conflict. We often justify our impulsive reactions with the excuse that it is the right thing to do, but true justice is never impulsive. Jesus shows us that it is possible to act with determination without losing control, correct mistakes without letting anger dominate us, and defend what is fair without compromising our inner peace. This balance is a reflection of Jesus' intimacy with the Father. His calm did not come from human strength, but from his constant connection with God. He knew who he was, what his mission was, and what needed to be done, and this enabled him to act in a precise and controlled manner, even in moments of righteous indignation. This confidence is what enables us to face challenging situations with the same serenity, knowing that God is in control and that his promises are firm. As we observe Jesus' calm control of his emotions, we are encouraged to seek the same balance in our lives. His firmness without impulsiveness, his zeal without being out of control, and his determination without losing his serenity are examples that challenge us to trust God in all situations and to act in a way that reflects his character. Inner peace as a testimony. The serenity that Jesus demonstrated not only directly influenced those around him, but also became a powerful message about the kingdom of God. He did not need to use elaborate words or long speeches to reveal the peace that lived in his heart. His very presence was enough to transform environments and calm distressed hearts. A clear example of this is found in Matthew 11:28-30, when Jesus makes an invitation that resonates deeply for all who seek rest. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." These words of Jesus were not only a promise of relief, but also a revelation of his own nature. He describes himself as meek and humble, characteristics that reflect the inner peace he lived in and wanted to share with all who came to him. In a world where the weight of responsibilities, expectations, and worries were overwhelming, Jesus offered something completely different. Indeed, a lightness that came from total surrender to the Father. This invitation from Jesus was profoundly countercultural, both then and today. We live in a world that values performance, achievement, and external strength. But Jesus invites us to a rest that does not depend on external circumstances. He calls us to lay down our burdens to him and take up his yoke, which is easy and light. This lightness is not the result of a human effort, but of a divine exchange. We give our worries, anxieties, and weights to Jesus, and in return, we receive his peace. Jesus' inner peace was so evident that it attracted people of all backgrounds. The weary, the oppressed, and the despised found in him a safe haven, a place where they could rest from their struggles and find renewal. This peace was not something he simply offered, but something he personified. When looking at Jesus, it was impossible not to see that he was in complete harmony with the Father. And this harmony manifested itself as a tranquility that disarmed fears and dispelled anxieties. Jesus' invitation to find rest in his peace is also a call to learn from him. When he says, "Learn from me," he reminds us that inner peace is not something we achieve all at once, but something we learn and cultivate in our walk with God. As we observe how Jesus lived, how he reacted to pressure, and how he trusted the Father, we begin to understand that this peace is not a passive state, but a fruit of an intimate and ongoing relationship with God. This peace that Jesus experienced was also a powerful testimony to those around him. It revealed that the kingdom of God is not a place of restlessness or competition, but a place of rest and trust. Amid the demands of his ministry, Jesus never let himself be carried away by haste or anxiety. He knew when it was time to teach, heal, and minister, and when it was time to withdraw and be alone with the Father. This wisdom in balancing work and rest was a practical demonstration of the peace he offered. The contrast between the peace of Jesus and the turmoil of the world was evident in every interaction he had. While religious leaders were always concerned with maintaining their traditions and status, and the crowds often sought miracles to alleviate their immediate suffering, Jesus remained focused on his mission without being carried away by human expectations. He lived in a state of total surrender to the Father, and this surrender was the source of his peace. This testimony of peace was not only to be observed, but also to be shared. When Jesus said, "Take my yoke upon you," he was inviting us to walk alongside him, learn his rhythm, and experience his lightness. This journey with Jesus is not without challenges, but it is marked by one certainty: he is by our side, carrying our weights and teaching us to trust. The inner peace that Jesus experienced was also a direct response to the concerns that often rule the human heart. Worries about the future, fear of failure, and the weight of expectations are burdens that often keep us from the tranquility that God desires for us. But Jesus, with his words and actions, shows us that it is possible to live differently. He invites us to rest in his presence, to trust in his care, and to allow his peace to rule our hearts. The testimony of Jesus continues to resonate in our day, calling us to abandon the weight we carry and experience the lightness that comes from a heart aligned with God. His meekness and humility were not signs of weakness, but expressions of the strength that comes from a peace that cannot be shaken by circumstances. Silence as a response to criticism. Jesus' calmness was evident in all circumstances, but it stood out even more when he faced unfair criticism and judgment. His silence, in situations where anyone else would defend or counterattack, demonstrated not only his trust in God, but also his control over emotions and words. A powerful example of this occurs in Luke 6:1-11, when the Pharisees tried to use his actions against him, looking for reasons to accuse him. Jesus and his disciples were walking through a wheat field on a Sabbath, and they began to pick ears of corn, rub them in their hands, and eat the grains. To the Pharisees, this was a violation of the Sabbath, and they promptly questioned Jesus, "Why are you doing what is not permitted on the Sabbath?" This charge reflected a rigid, legalistic view of the law, an approach the Pharisees used to control people and maintain their authority. Jesus' response was not an outburst of anger, but an assertive calm that cut through the superficiality of the criticism and revealed the depth of the truth. He challenged them to think beyond the letter of the law, reminding them of how David and his men ate the showbread, something that was technically also against the law, but was permitted because it met a legitimate human need. With this response, Jesus not only defended his disciples, but also pointed to the true meaning of the Sabbath as a day of rest and renewal, not oppression. Jesus' calmness was also manifested in his ability to remain unaffected by the malicious intentions of his critics. The Pharisees were not really interested in learning or understanding. They were looking for reasons to condemn. This posture can be seen again when Jesus, on another Sabbath, entered the synagogue and found a man with a withered hand. The Pharisees watched him closely, waiting for him to heal the man so they could accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. Jesus knew exactly what was happening. He realized the Pharisees' intentions, but did not react with hostility or sarcasm. Instead, he asked the man to get up and stand before everyone. Then Jesus asked a question that exposed the hypocrisy of his critics. Is it permissible on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? This simple yet deeply challenging question revealed the true essence of God's law and the hardened hearts of those who used it to attack Jesus. This stance of Jesus is a powerful reminder that not all criticism needs to be responded to with words or lengthy justifications. Sometimes silence or a brief but wise response is more effective in disarming critics and preserving inner peace. Jesus was not consumed by the desire to prove his worth or to convince those who were already determined to reject him. His calm came from a deep understanding of his identity and his mission, something that no criticism could shake. This approach from Jesus challenges us to reflect on how we deal with criticism in our own lives. When we are attacked or misunderstood, our instinctive reaction is to defend ourselves or attack back. We want to clear up misunderstandings or protect ourselves from unfair accusations. But Jesus shows us that often the best response is to remain calm and trust that the truth will reveal itself at the right time. This calm is not passivity, but an expression of faith in God and trust in his judgment. Jesus' serenity in the face of criticism also teaches us about the importance of discerning when to speak and when to remain silent. He did not allow the Pharisees to divert him from his mission or trap him in unproductive arguments. When he spoke, his words were clear, incisive, and always pointed to God's truth. When he chose silence, his example demonstrated strength and self-control, reminding us that not every confrontation needs to be resolved with words. Jesus' calmness, especially in confrontational situations, was a demonstration of his commitment to what really mattered. He was not interested in winning arguments or proving his point to those who were not willing to listen. His priority was to fulfill the Father's will, and this gave him the freedom not to get involved in unnecessary debates. This focus is something we can all learn from, especially in a world where opinions and judgments are often expressed impulsively and superficially. By observing how Jesus handled criticism, we can learn to trust God more in our own interactions. He reminds us that we don't need to carry the burden of justifying ourselves to every accusation or convincing everyone of our perspective. His calm was a reflection of his confidence that the Father was in control, and that confidence remains available to us today. The calm that transforms the future. The serenity that Jesus experienced in his walk on earth was not only a reflection of his connection with the Father, but also a living promise that this same calm is available to those who trust in God. His words not only comforted, but also pointed to a future transformed by this peace. One of the most powerful moments in which Jesus conveyed this assurance was recorded in Matthew 28:20, when he declared, "And I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." These words were spoken shortly after his resurrection, as he commissioned the disciples to take the gospel to the world. They had experienced the despair of his death and the joy of his resurrection, but now they faced a future full of challenges and uncertainty. How could they carry out such a huge mission, facing persecution, opposition, and a world that seemed to be against them? The answer was in Jesus' promise. He wouldn't leave them alone. Your presence would be the source of strength and calm, guiding them at every step. Jesus' statement was not just a comfort to the disciples, but a reaffirmation that the calm and peace he demonstrated in life would continue to be available to all who trusted in him. He knew that the world would bring tribulations, but he also knew that his constant presence would be enough to sustain those who followed his voice. This promise teaches us that the calm that transforms the future is not something we achieve on our own, but something we receive by walking with Christ. The disciples, who had previously hidden out of fear of the Jews, soon became courageous proclaimers of the gospel. The transformation that occurred in them was not the result of human effort, but the direct impact of Jesus' presence in their lives. The certainty that he was with them, even after his ascension, enabled them to face threats, rejections, and even death with a serenity that reflected the same calm as Christ. This transformation was so evident that many who watched their lives were touched and drawn into the kingdom of God. Jesus' promise to be with us until the end of time also challenges us to look at the future with a different perspective. We are often consumed by anxieties about what is to come. Fear of the unknown and the uncertainty of tomorrow can paralyze us or lead us to make impulsive decisions. However, the presence of Jesus assures us that no matter what we face, he will be by our side, guiding and strengthening us. This certainty allows us to move forward calmly, trusting that he is already in control of every detail. The calm that transforms the future also empowers us to live differently in the present. When we know that Jesus is with us, we are freed from the pressures of trying to control everything or seeking validation from the world. We can rest in his peace, knowing that our future is safe in his hands. This freedom allows us to focus on what really matters: loving God, loving people, and living according to kingdom values. This promise also invites us to reflect on how we are responding to the challenges that come our way. We often face difficulties with worry or despair, forgetting that we are not alone. But Jesus, by promising his presence, reminds us that calm is not the absence of problems, but the certainty that he is with us in each one of them. When we allow this truth to guide our lives, we experience a peace that passes all understanding. Jesus' statement also carries a call to action. Your presence is not just a comfort, but a training for the mission. He not only accompanies us, but also guides and strengthens us so that we can be light in the midst of darkness and hope in the midst of chaos. The calm we receive from his presence is not just for our own benefit, but to be shared with those around us. Just as the disciples transformed the world with their lives and words, we are also called to impact our communities and families with the same calm that comes from Christ. Jesus' promise to be with us until the end of time also points to the fullness of the kingdom of God, which is yet to come. While we live on this earth, we face challenges, but we know that the future is already assured. This hope is not just a comfort, but a source of strength that allows us to persevere calmly and confidently, knowing that in the end, victory belongs to God. Jesus, by promising his presence, gave us a solid foundation to face the future without fear. His calm, demonstrated in every aspect of his life and reaffirmed by his words, is an invitation to trust him fully, no matter what comes. The certainty that he is with us transforms us, enabling us to live and act with the same serenity that he demonstrated, and to share this calm with a world that needs it so much. Did you realize the depth of Jesus' lessons about the power of calm? Every teaching, every gesture, and every word reveals a path of peace, confidence, and strength in the midst of chaos. What we see here is not just history, but an urgent call for our times. The prophecies are fulfilled before our eyes, and the peace that Jesus offers is not just a comfort, but a preparation to face the difficult times that are to come. We live in times where fear, anxiety, and uncertainty dominate, but Jesus shows us that even in the most intense storms, there is unshakable peace in store for those who trust in him. He promised us, "I will be with you until the end of the age." This promise is the anchor that sustains us, and the light that guides our path, especially when the world seems to be falling apart. Now, I invite you to reflect. Are you prepared for what's to come? The lessons of calm and trust in Jesus are not just inspirational messages. They are spiritual tools that strengthen us to face the trials of the last days. Each teaching is a reminder that we are not alone, and that God is in control, even when all seems lost. If this content spoke to your heart, share this video with as many people as possible. There are many lives that need to hear this message and find the peace that only Jesus can give. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, don't miss the opportunity to receive more reflections that will help you become spiritually stronger. Click the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join this community that seeks to grow in faith and hope. Jesus called us to be light in the midst of darkness. Let's spread this message together, reach lives, and prepare for the end times with confidence and peace in our hearts. May God bless you and lead you on the journey to eternity.